So we had, this was way back in the beginning, and the important point here was really just distinguishing that in this media, art, and technology course, we talked about how media and technology actually were characteristic of each of these eras. And if you remember from the midterm, I asked you then, and may ask you again this time, you know, what was the Enlightenment era known for? And you know, the answer is that it was known for the printing press. So that's going to be all from that lecture. How about that? Pretty simple. Let me get you up to it. What we're doing now is going over the stuff from that first you know, that first 25% that's going to be based on the first few weeks. So, oh, well, and of course, well, when we went to this lecture, the important point was that everybody thinks art is great, everybody thinks art is important, but people don't go to museums and galleries very much, hardly at all. And so there's this disconnect between what people think is important and what people actually practice. I'm going to remind you as I'm going through this that all of this material is copyright and cannot be shared or made public in any way, right? Just so you know that. Oh, and remember we saw this movie by Sister Wendy Beckett. She was the art appreciation instructor. That was important. And here, you know, to wrap it up, I gave you 3 simple definitions of what art is, how culture constructs it, and again, you were asked in the midterm and might be asked again, you know, what is functionalism, and that is what art does. Proceduralism was how societies shape it, and historicism was obviously how it changes over time. But remember functionalism. All right. Next slide. So if you remember, then we moved into you know, that first lecture raised the question that if people think art's important but they're not doing it or seeing it, what do they like? And we discussed how our lives and indeed aspects of our creative lives are actually expressed through consumerism. And we spoke a lot of this was about what is termed that third item, symbolic creativity, that when you decorate your room, post on Instagram, decide what kind of car you want to buy. These are actually aesthetic expressions that you make. Although most people don't give themselves credit for these things. You know, even getting dressed in the morning is a kind of symbolic creativity. And symbolic creativity, as it was discussed in the reading, is an aspect of a discipline called cultural studies. So symbolic creativity, cultural studies, that would be the point to remember. And then we talked about the flip side of this was that shopping is also exploitive and not so good. And we saw this video by Reverend Billy, the evangelist who criticized shopping. And then to kind of give a analytical framework to the whole discussion, we talked about how consumer culture and advertising in particular have this funny way of confusing in our minds the difference between things we need and things we want. And you know, you read and we talked about how many people say, oh, I just can't afford the things I really need, when they have a perfectly nice home, perfectly nice car, perfectly nice job or school. Their wants and needs get confused because they're really talking about things they want. So I think that's enough for that one. So let's just skip ahead. So just before the midterm, we had a lecture on naming, and we talked about how different kinds of names are popular, et cetera, but the thing I'd like you to remember is this notion of how, besides our personal names, culturally, labeling theory often assigns people to categories which partly reflect them, but also don't. And that this can be positive, but it can also be negative when you're stuck with a label about your group, about yourself, about the identity that you may carry or present. Labeling can be good and labeling can be bad. So that brings us to, this concludes the stuff prior to the midterm. So let's move along. So following the midterm, we had a reading and a discussion about difference, and probably the thing that I wanted to ask you to remember is the key distinction that we talked about is between difference being a problem and difference being an asset. This is one of these issues that it's hard to hold two opposing viewpoints in your mind at the same time. But on one hand, in this United States of America, we want to share certain common values, but not at the expense of the many different places we come from and the different identities we carry. So we looked at that. For comic relief, we looked at, well, it wasn't comic, it was a kind of tragic episode in this movie Falling Down, where the actor Michael Douglas played an angry white man who went into a Korean grocery store and who was very upset about the disconnect between what he expected and what he found. So I think that's all from that slide. On that. That's good. Following lecture was about fear, and you know, I know from talking to some of you that this issue of fear and anxiety is not something that people take very lightly. But the the key concept in the fear we get from online media or news media is that because certain kinds of events are over-represented in the media, we tend to think that the world is more dangerous and threatening than it is. You know, I'm going to tell you, I don't watch news on TV, but I have a few news apps on my phone. You know, and I like the Washington Post. I like to check on the BBC. But the one I go to first is CNN. And I think I'm going to stop looking at CNN on my phone, because as I scroll down, CNN has really become, I mean, all of their stories are about bloodshed, death, and awfulness. And I think of, you know, my friends' parents who only watch TV, and I thought, man, if my view of the world was defined solely by that CNN feed that I scroll down, I would think that bad stuff is about to happen to me any minute. So people fear the wrong things as a result of this overexposure. And then the other aspect of this is that fear also sells products. And, you know, that had to do with all of the, you know, things from fear that your health will fade and that you have to protect yourself with vitamins or eating certain foods or buying certain products, driving certain cars, that you know, we don't always recognize that underlying a lot of advertising, you know, even beauty and health products, which in the case of beauty products, speak to our fear that maybe people won't look at me the way I'd like them to, or I won't have as many friends. Fear underlies a lot of things you might not recognize. So fear sells product. So I'm skipping to the lecture in which we made those collages, and the key point I made in introducing this is this whole issue that I've talked about a bunch of times even today, is that we all believe that we know what we know, and we have these foundational beliefs that are part of us. But the important part of that lecture, which is an underlying element in what this course is supposed to help you think about, is that most everything we know, most everything we believe, has come to us from some other source. You know, no one is born being an engineer, no one is born being an artist, no one is born being a Christian, no one is born being a Democrat, you know. All these things are acquired, and examining the sources of what we believe and what we know is really important. So knowledge is conditioned, and that is interesting and important to keep in mind. And again, what is a collage? It's not what UCI is. It's not what Orange Coast College is. College and collage are different words. Collage was that thing we did by pasting it. It's an art technique, so please remember that. there, we talked about dialogue, yada yada. This is not what I want you to remember. Oh, here, this is a place marker, but it was a concept that we talked about, and that was, we had previously talked about advertising affecting us in our daily lives. This was one of a couple of discussions that I introduced to you about how advertising and commerce are increasingly in schools. And so Captive Audiences was focused on how little children get exposed to commercial messages even when they're supposed to be protected. And then we saw a guy named Henry Giroux, who was an educator who spoke about public pedagogy, but the concept that you read about, for the broader concept that he's a part of, was called critical pedagogy. So Henry Giroux, critical pedagogy, and the critical pedagogy is basically a form of education. Pedagogy being another word for education. So critical pedagogy means education, and Henry Giroux was the educator who spoke about that. I don't ask you to remember a whole lot of people, but he's pretty important. And then, just to depress everybody, I reminded us all, because I regularly look up these numbers, that 45 million students have student loans, and the picture isn't pretty. One of the benefits of a public university like UCI is that it makes that less of an issue, but I know that it doesn't make it go away because of the fact that even UCI costs a lot of money. And that's no joke, for sure. So after talking about the way media, art, and technology operate in both the academic, artistic side and the commercial market side, we talked about how speech gets controlled or not controlled. And one of the points that we made, or we talked about, was that, these concepts of free speech and censorship often get tossed around. One of the things I discuss in that lecture is that total censorship is in fact impossible because people will talk, and I gave you the example of, my friend in Poland going to plays where the government was not critiqued directly, but in metaphoric form through the figure of a grouchy father. And similarly, we talked about how, though we like to think that speech is free in this country, there are all kinds of ways that it is legally or constitutionally limited, or that it's limited simply by the fact that you can't speak your mind in every place, in every context. So there's no such thing as total censorship, and there's no such thing as free speech, was the point there. And then, because I want you to remember at least one artist in this class. Remember, we looked at that video about the life of Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a photographer. Remember, he was the one who photographed celebrities, flowers, plants, and some sexualized images that became the site of a lot of controversy in the arts and in American politics for a while. So we talked about acting locally, and we talked about impediments to impediments that we all face, like getting off our butts and getting involved with doing things or contributing or volunteering. And one of them is that sometimes we let our competitive impulses, which can be very good, get out of control. And one of the things I pointed out was that Adam Smith, who's often credited with being one of the architects of American capitalism, and who said that self-interest, interest in the individual ultimately promotes the interest of the group. He was an economist, but he was also a moral philosopher. So he also, and this is something people don't ever talk about when they talk about Smith, was that he also believed that capitalism promotes the impulse in giving back to society, which I know from talking to many of you is something that you all recognize that you want to do when you leave UCI. You want to get jobs, have great careers, families, etc., but you also want to give back and are not absorbed overly in competition, as important as it is. So that Smith said that people are self-motivated, but also naturally want to help others, and that whole point was further underscored when we talked about the anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who studied cultures around the world, and in his book The Gift talked about the impulse to give to others. And one thing I don't think I mentioned there is that the field of positive psychology tells us that one of the under-acknowledged aspects of giving, of helping others, of sharing, is that it makes the giver feel good. That there's we actually derive pleasure from sharing and helping other people, and it has nothing to do with ethics or economics. It's just an aspect of brain operation. So, see, we're getting near the end now. Some of this should sound familiar. So we talked about thinking globally and looking at the big picture and et cetera, probably the one thing that I asked you to remember. Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I can't find it. Oh no. I'm going to have to go back. I missed one. Here. This is an easy one. When we talk about destroying the planet, just remember that UCI's F. Sherwood Rowland was responsible for discovering the destruction done to the ozone layer by certain chemicals. So, ozone layer, F. Sherwood Rowland, and let me just go back to that last lecture. I just had one point about freedom that I forgot to remind you of. I'll go back to the prior lecture. Sorry. So, again, before we started talking about democracy, we also spoke last time about, or the time before that, about freedom. And the point being that freedom is another one of those terms that gets thrown around without people often examining it. It's like equality, another great American value we talked about today. But there is that negative freedom that Robert Reich talked about in that video about saving capitalism. He said there's a tendency to see freedom as meaning being free from things so that I can do my own thing. And that's an important kind of freedom, but it's got to be balanced by what's termed positive freedom, which has to do with that other expression we talked about today called equity, which is that everybody has the same degree of freedom to pursue and achieve what they want. And this is, and this positive freedom is embodied in the concept of equity, in which people who might be starting out the race a little behind, in the interest in fairness, are helped to get up to the starting point that everybody else is at, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, I think, I'm just trying to think if there's anything from today that might be on the quiz. And let me see. No. Oh, just remember that Saving Capitalism was by Robert Reich. So, I don't know, gang. I think that's it. I think that I'm going to send you